They're watching a reality they thought was solid dissolve in front of their eyes, and every unspoken warning you carried is suddenly finding its echo in their lives. The calm you're holding right now is not the calm of ignorance. It's the steadiness of someone who's already walked the ground they're only now beginning to feel quake beneath them. You've been reading signs they didn't even notice were there, sensing a pattern long before it became visible to anyone else. It's not the thrill of proving them wrong that sits heavy in this moment. It's the quiet knowing that the shift you felt deep within months ago has finally breached the surface. While they lost themselves in shallow distractions, you were tracing a deeper current moving beneath it all. Now, every mask they wore is thinning, every illusion they leaned on is bending, and you're standing in the still point where the storm meets its own truth. You're not here by chance. Feel the pull? Tap Join to unlock truth, purpose, and a tribe that gets it. This is more than a membership. It's your calling. They called it suspicion, but it was the sharp vision of a soul tuned to movements beyond the surface. What you felt before anyone spoke a word wasn't fear. It was the silent hum of truth pressing against the walls of the unseen. Long before events began to show themselves, your spirit was charting a map that no one else could read, sensing the hidden seams where everything would eventually split open. The shifts arriving now carry the weight of inevitability. The quiet conversations you once left unfinished are playing themselves out in real time. The uneasiness that kept you alert wasn't born from restlessness. It was the unmistakable rhythm of a coming turn. Every subtle glance, every tone that rang too flat, every interaction that unsettled your inner balance has returned now as living evidence. Blessed by His grace? Click Super Thank You and give $20 to spread His light. Your gift plants seeds that grow His kingdom. Be the blessing. While they entertained illusions dressed as harmony, you felt the air growing heavy with contradiction. Beneath the smiles and polite words, you could hear the quiet scrape of something decaying. It was never about mistrust for its own sake. It was about recognizing the texture of falseness before it had a chance to harden. They danced in rooms filled with borrowed light, unaware that the source was already flickering. The instincts they dismissed were simply tuned to a wider field. You could feel the weight behind gestures, the shadows trailing certain words, the cold undercurrent that followed certain presences. These were not passing impressions. They were the early signals of collapse. And now, the very dynamics you warned about are no longer whispers but open displays. The collision they're experiencing now is more than confusion. It's the tearing sound of beliefs being ripped from their anchors. The structures they leaned on have begun to sway, and every familiar role is slipping into something unrecognizable. The suddenness of it is disorienting, but the truth has been moving toward them for far longer than they realize. What they feel as chaos is simply the unveiling. Their leaders, their trusted voices, the systems they thought would always stand, all are revealing the fractures you had already traced. This is not the arrival of disaster but the exposure of what was always there, cloaked in a convincing disguise. You didn't stumble here by accident, you were led. If something in your spirit is stirring, don't ignore it. Tap Join to access exclusive content, prophetic insights, and a community of purpose-driven souls. This isn't just a membership, it's your moment of alignment. Step into who you were born to be. Welcome to the chosen. And so, the dissonance settles in. Minds that once resisted your warnings are now scrambling to reconcile the sharp turn their world has taken. It is not revenge you're holding in your hands. It is the clarity of one who learned to see without needing proof, to prepare without needing permission, and to walk steady when the ground under others gives way. What they're wrestling with now isn't a passing fog. It's the crushing weight of realizing their entire inner framework was built on falsehoods that could never survive the clock's slow unveiling. Beneath the noise of their confusion, there was always a deeper mechanism at work, one you could feel before there was proof, a rhythm of deception too precise to be coincidence. The roots of this distortion stretch far beyond their own lifetimes. It was inherited, carried forward like an unspoken family heirloom that no one claimed yet everyone obeyed. The nights when your thoughts sharpened into uncomfortable clarity were not about the present moment alone. They were encounters with the residue of decisions forged by hands long gone, setting into motion a cycle that only a watchful soul like yours could interrupt. Their distancing from you was never as casual as they pretended. Every missing invitation, every forced smile, every carefully placed silence was part of a blueprint. The fracture didn't happen because you drifted apart. It was constructed, piece by piece, under the cover of normalcy. The goal was simple: erase the one who could see too much. Whispers were seeded not because you were loud, but because your very existence unsettled their fragile balance. They recast you as excessive, unreasonable, or disruptive, not because it was true, but because the alternative, that you were accurate, would detonate the stories they had sworn to protect. Their world relied on performance, not authenticity. It was bound together by a shared pact never to look beneath the surface, never to question the symmetry of the picture they were presenting. You became a problem not for speaking loudly, but for refusing to play the part they scripted for you. Each truth you voiced acted like a small fracture in the polished walls they'd built. Every moment you refused to bend your vision to match their illusion was a moment their arrangement of pretenses began to wobble. The threat wasn't in your words alone. It was in the fact that you kept your eyes open when theirs were closed. Now, the design they fought to preserve is unraveling in plain sight. The structures they swore were untouchable are giving way, not because you pushed, but because the weight of reality has finally caught up with their carefully engineered silence. The moment your vision cut through their pretenses, it forced them to face the parts of themselves they had spent years keeping in shadow. That level of self-confrontation felt far more dangerous to them than any outside force, so removing you became a necessity. But this exile wasn't born from petty offense. It was designed to shield something far more sinister than bruised egos. The hidden network you were unknowingly brushing against wasn't made of simple personal flaws. It was layered with calculated exploitation, the quiet manipulation of resources, and the use of influence to strip the powerless of their voice. You were standing too close to the core of a structure built entirely on what could never withstand the light, and your presence alone threatened to bring the whole thing into view. Being cast out wasn't a sentence, it was an extraction. It was the unseen hand pulling you from a place that had already marked you as a danger to its survival. Though the emptiness felt like abandonment, it was actually a shield, keeping you from collapsing under the same weight that would eventually bury the very people who pushed you away. What they called removal was in fact a redirection. Their walls were already cracking, but they needed a figure to carry the fault so no one would look too closely at the real source of the damage. You became the decoy for their decay, freeing them to ignore the evidence until it became impossible to hide. Every hour you spent apart from them was quietly fortifying you. Without their constant presence, their approval, or their permission, your spirit learned to stand without leaning on borrowed stability. What they saw as banishment was actually the slow construction of a foundation they couldn't touch. Each act of rejection shaped your capacity to speak with an authority untethered from applause. The distance was not an empty desert, it was a forge, molding you for the moment when silence would no longer be an option. The very isolation they thought would diminish you became the breeding ground for a strength they never anticipated. And when their collapse arrived, you were no longer tied to their approval or their systems. You had been prepared in the hardest way possible, not by comfort, but by the stripping away of every false anchor, so that when truth finally demanded to be spoken, you could stand without flinching. They expected answers to arrive wrapped in a voice that soothed rather than stirred, in a tone that aligned with their own comforts instead of reshaping them. What came instead was the very opposite: direct, piercing, uncompromising truth. And in that irony lay the twist they never saw coming. The one they pushed furthest away was the one carrying the exact guidance they had been asking for in secret. When help refuses to conform to the image the human mind imagines, it often meets resistance. That's what happened here. The insight you carried didn't flatter their self-image. It dismantled the illusions they relied on. And instead of receiving the clarity they claimed to seek, they turned their energy toward discrediting the one bringing it. This is not a new pattern. It stretches across time and cultures. But in this moment, its consequences are immediate. The direction they once dismissed as unnecessary is now the very understanding they are scrambling to obtain. The counsel they ignored has matured into the exact solutions their present chaos demands. What they refused in the name of comfort has left them standing exposed to the very harm you once tried to shield them from. And yet, there is no error in higher timing. The distance that felt like loss was never meant to deprive you. It was meant to preserve you. Their applause was not needed for your protection to remain intact. The separation wasn't random. It was positioning. While they celebrated your absence, the space you gained was being used to prepare you for a moment in which your words would land with undeniable force. It was the slow shaping of your voice into something that could hold the weight of both warning and vindication. Your task was never limited to the immediate crisis. Beneath it all, you had been sent to sever inherited chains. Patterns passed down so quietly they began to feel like the natural order. These cycles weren't unique to them. They were echoes from long before any of you existed, repeated until someone strong enough stepped in to disrupt them. The challenge you presented wasn't confined to your message. It was embodied in your presence. You stood as a living contradiction to the belief that these entrenched patterns were unchangeable. And in doing so, you made the impossible suddenly imaginable, which was precisely why you could not be allowed to remain. Their choice to reject what they saw wasn't born from ignorance. It was a deliberate preference for the familiar, even if that familiarity was rooted in distortion. The evidence was there, the shifts were noticeable, but acknowledging them would have required dismantling too much at once. And now, what is settling in their awareness is not just regret. It is the recognition that they were never blind, only unwilling to see. That the discomfort you brought into their lives was not a threat, but the very thing that could have freed them, had they been ready to let it. They recognized the danger signs just as clearly as you did. They felt the same shift in the air, sensed the same wrongness pressing at the edges of their comfort. But while you gave voice to what was hidden, they locked their own observations away, hoping silence would protect them. What unsettled them about you was never the truth itself. It was that you were willing to give it form, to speak aloud what they lacked the nerve to face. Their unity was built on a single unwritten law: never disturb the stillness, even if the stillness is built on rot. You broke that pact the moment you refused to let false calm outweigh reality. And by doing so, you revealed the price they were willing to pay to keep their fragile balance intact. When you withheld your agreement from things that demanded opposition, when you refused to validate harm with a polite smile, the quiet architecture of their world began to tremble. They saw then that their version of peace was nothing more than an unspoken alliance to ignore the damage in front of them. What rattles them now is not just the exposure of what was hidden, but the realization that silence was never a neutral act. Every unspoken objection, every conversation they didn't have, every harmful pattern they allowed to breathe, these became the bricks in the walls surrounding their dysfunction. Each time they chose to look away rather than address what they knew was wrong, they weren't simply avoiding discomfort, they were actively fortifying the very forces they now claimed to despise. Their refusal to confront small fractures allowed those fractures to grow into something that could no longer be contained. The reckoning unfolding in their lives isn't about a simple misjudgment. It's about coming to terms with how willingly they traded long-term stability for the fleeting safety of denial. They now face the weight of knowing their inaction was a choice, one that shaped the outcome they're desperate to escape. The truth is, the temporary ease they protected has dissolved, but the damage they enabled will outlast the momentary relief they once prized. What's collapsing around them is not just their illusions. It's the entire structure they spent years preserving with their fear of facing the truth. They didn't just keep quiet because they were afraid. They kept quiet because the silence paid well. The very systems you tried to bring into the light were the same ones filling their pockets, opening doors, and securing their place in social hierarchies. Speaking the truth would have meant severing ties to the benefits they had grown dependent on, and comfort outweighed conscience. What they called keeping the peace was, in reality, protecting their own stake in a structure built on exploitation. The more they ignored the warning signs, the more the system rewarded them. But now that the foundation is crumbling, the rewards have turned to dust in their hands. Connections that once elevated them are now dangerous to be associated with. Opportunities they once bragged about are revealing their poisoned roots. The material gains they used to justify their silence are disappearing, dissolving under the weight of the very corruption that created them. The practical decisions they once defended as wisdom are now showing themselves for what they truly were: short-term trades for long-term ruin. What looked like prosperity has revealed itself as the slow decay of their integrity. The image of unity they projected is collapsing under scrutiny. People who once swore loyalty to each other are now scattering, desperate to create distance before the truth implicates them. Bonds built on mutual secrecy are breaking apart as denial becomes more valuable than friendship. In the unraveling, the facade of community has proven to be nothing more than a fragile alliance of self-interest. Your removal from their gatherings wasn't just an act of exclusion, it became a gift of perspective. Being outside their orbit allowed you to see what they couldn't. The hidden lines connecting each crisis, the way every isolated incident was part of a larger design. Their proximity to the chaos kept them too distracted to recognize the pattern. Your distance made it impossible to miss. While they stayed entangled in emotional debts and unspoken pacts, you were piecing together the true scope of what was happening. The turbulence they experienced in fragments, you saw as one coordinated movement, an undercurrent pulling everything toward collapse. That clarity came not in spite of your distance, but because of it. The conflict you recognized wasn't symbolic. It was a deliberate and organized effort to dismantle truth from the inside out. It thrived on subtle coercion, on conditioning people to doubt their instincts, on painting those who questioned too much as dangerous or unstable. Your awareness of these tactics made you an immediate threat to their arrangement. You were both the one who could see the entire game and the one who refused to play by its rules. That combination made you someone they couldn't afford to keep close. And so, your removal served a dual purpose. It protected you from being absorbed into their collapse, and it gave you the vantage point to witness the full scope of what they were trying so hard to hide. In the end, you were not just excluded, you were positioned to understand the battle for what it truly was. A fight to keep consciousness from becoming contagious. From where you stood on the outside, the repeating patterns became impossible to ignore. What they treated as isolated mistakes were actually long-running sequences coded into the way their world functioned. Behaviors passed from one generation to the next, normalized until they no longer looked like choices at all. The warnings you voiced were never about a single event. They were about the deeper engine driving all of it. The current breakdown they're facing isn't random. It's the predictable outcome of unresolved fractures that were never acknowledged, decisions made decades ago still echoing in the present. The insight you gathered while cut off from them is now the very key that explains why their reality is unraveling exactly as you said it would. What they once mocked as overthinking has turned into the only map that makes sense of their chaos. The record you kept in silence, every mental note, every moment of clarity, is now the playbook they desperately need but can't bring themselves to ask for. And yet, the real revelation you gained in Exile went beyond diagnosing their dysfunction. It was the discovery of a hidden current running parallel to the visible world, connecting people far beyond the boundaries of their familiar circles. You began meeting others who had been cast aside for the same reason you had, individuals marked by the ability to see clearly in places where blindness was enforced. Each story mirrored your own in a different form, making it clear that what happened to you was not an isolated case, but part of a much larger reality. This web of connection was never built through titles or institutions. It formed quietly, stitched together by the shared recognition of patterns others refused to acknowledge. It was the slow emergence of a network that doesn't require proximity to function, bound instead by the rare ability to recognize truth even when it costs everything. Your exile revealed something most people never notice: That the same forces at work in one small circle are often at work in many others, wearing different masks but operating with the same intent. The strategies used to discredit, isolate, and neutralize the aware were not unique to your situation. They were part of a larger script playing out across countless environments. The connections you forged during that time apart weren't accidents. They were alignments, positioning you alongside others whose insight and resilience matched your own. While your former circle busied itself protecting illusions, you were quietly building relationships that would form the framework for what comes next. The resistance you encountered back then is the same resistance others in this network faced, because the struggle wasn't about one group or one place. It was about something larger, a widespread effort to keep perception contained. Your time in the shadows wasn't wasted. It was preparation, equipping you to recognize and connect with others who have been tempered by the same fire. Now, as the illusions begin to collapse, the ground you've been standing on is already fortified. You are not returning as someone seeking a place. You return as someone who has already found one, among others who have been positioned for the exact moment that is now arriving. The bonds anchored in honesty have shown themselves to be worth infinitely more than the ones held together by convenience. When you stopped trying to persuade and simply lived the reality you knew, the entire atmosphere around you shifted. That quiet shift carried more influence than any defense you could have spoken, because it moved from explanation to embodiment. The absence of your voice wasn't retreat. It was a declaration that truth needs no constant rehearsal. That quiet became the loudest statement you could make about what was already on its way into the open. You let time stand as your witness, knowing it would eventually reveal what no amount of debate could accomplish. And while they mistook your stillness for surrender, something far greater was taking shape, an alignment of circumstances that only the right moment could unlock. Each day without your involvement layered more weight onto the eventual unveiling. The pause they interpreted as exhaustion was actually precision, a refusal to fight battles that would win themselves. The wisdom was in knowing when to stop speaking so the truth could speak for itself. What once comforted them about your silence has now become the very thing unsettling them. Without your responses to anchor their narratives, they've had to live with the echo of their own choices. And that echo has grown heavier with every passing season, unsoftened by your explanations or justifications. Your silence didn't just preserve your own clarity, it cleared the stage for their actions to play out without interference. Every step they took without your engagement led them closer to the outcome they now face, unshielded by the distractions of conflict. Without your presence in their conversations, the sound they hear most is their own. And in that space, you were being refined. Your words condensed into something sharper, something that would carry far beyond the moment of personal validation. By holding back, you were allowing your perspective to transform into guidance that couldn't be dismissed as self-interest. The authority forming in that waiting period was never about simply proving a point. It was about preparing to lead from a place untouched by the need for vindication. When the time came to speak again, it would no longer be about defending the past. It would be about giving direction for the storms ahead, offering a voice that had been tempered not by argument, but by the discipline of restraint. And now, the power you carry is not just the power of being right. It's the readiness to step into the chaos your foresight predicted, not with bitterness, but with a clarity that comes only from surviving the quiet. The quiet you kept was not emptiness. It was the sharpening of a voice that would one day carry the weight of tested truth. That silence taught you to separate the words born from self-protection from the ones born to shift the atmosphere. What might once have come out as a need to prove yourself has been distilled into something far more potent, a message aligned with purpose, not pride. Now you carry the ability to speak about what is unfolding with a certainty that doesn't come from theory, but from the lived reality of having already seen it before it arrived. The change in the air feels deliberate, as if every twist and reversal had been arranged with precision. The figure they once branded as disruptive has become the voice they listen for when clarity is scarce. This transformation isn't about settling scores, it's about the reordering of influence. The same people who once dismissed your persistence are now faced with circumstances that demand the very kind of unflinching truth they once rejected. The same resistance they showed to you is now the obstacle they face in themselves. Those who accused you of darkening the mood are now drowning in the very heaviness they refused to face when there was still time to change it. Those who called you theatrical are living through scenes more chaotic than anything you warned about. And through it all, the situation has become a mirror, showing each person exactly who they are when the roles reverse. Some are arriving quietly, offering apologies they never thought they'd make, seeking the perspective they once treated with suspicion. Others are digging in, clinging to denial even as reality surrounds them. And a few are rewriting the past entirely, trying to erase the fact that they ever opposed you in the first place. These reactions are revealing more than words ever could. They are peeling back every carefully managed image, letting you see the unfiltered truth of character. For the first time, you're not guessing who stands where. Their own actions have made it undeniable. The rise you are experiencing has nothing to do with revenge. It is the restoration of what was taken from you, not by force, but by distortion. The credibility stripped away by whispers is being returned by events that cannot be spun. The voice they once tried to mute is now resonating louder than ever, carried not by politics or persuasion, but by the weight of time proving you right. What was silenced by human interference has been amplified by something far greater, something that cannot be overturned by opinion or erased by revision.